We're going to continue discussing the graph editor. Now you can use it to fine-tune your animation. So I brought back the barrel scene once again. That's in Chapter 10. I'm going to select that cylinder and go up to Window, Animation Editors, Graph Editor, and open up the Graph Editor. And once again, there are all the curves. I opened up an older version of this, so I have my scale once again. I'm not going to worry about the scale because those are static. We're going to go up to Translate Y right now, discuss how to manipulate that. So as I previously mentioned, you can select a keyframe and therefore show the tangent associated with that keyframe. You can pick either end of the keyframe tangent, like this side of the tangent, go to your Move tool and move that tangent around, therefore affect the shape of the curve as it flows through that keyframe. Now initially the tangent handle is welded. Both sides are welded like a seesaw, but you can pick the keyframe and break it if you want to. So select the keyframe, then go up to Keys, Break Tangents. That breaks the tangent into two halves. Once you do that, you're free to move each side independent of the other. Now, if you want to weld those tangent ends back together, you can do that. Just pick the keyframe, go back to Keys, and unify the tangents. And that makes it a single tangent handle once again. Now, so far we've moved keyframes just by selecting them and using the Move tool. You can freeform move them around. Or you can pick a keyframe and change the frame number that keyframe's on through the stats cell here, or the value it has over here. You can also scale keyframes, however, and that's most useful when you have more than one selected. So for example, if I select all these keyframes, I can go to the Scale tool right here and scale them. Now where you click drag from will affect how it scales, and what you have to do is use the middle mouse button for that. So I put my mouse over the first keyframe, and then middle mouse drag. To the left, it scales them towards the left, and it scales them towards that first keyframe. If I click drag towards the right with the middle mouse key, it scales to the right. So where you click drag from affects how that scale is happening. For instance, I can go to the end and do the same from there. I'll click drag from the end keyframe. You'll see that the curve goes towards the keyframe where I had my mouse. So you can scale from different areas of the curve. If I wanted just to make the animation shorter, I could start from frame 1 and pull the curve inward. If I wanted to make the entire animation longer, I'd go the opposite way. This also works on smaller sections. I can pick just a few keyframes in the center, like maybe down here, and scale those. In fact, I can scale from the center and have the keyframes go towards each other to shrink that section of the animation. So again, if you want to scale, pick several keyframes, or all the keyframes, choose your Scale tool, the middle mouse drag from the point where you want to scale around. Now I mentioned slope of these curves before. The slope really indicates the speed of the animation, because remember value is up and down here. So if you have a steep slope in between two keyframes, like keyframe here and keyframe here, if that's a steep slope, that means a more rapid change in value. That means that the object is therefore changing more rapidly. In terms of translate, it's moving faster through space. If this was rotate, it just would be rotating faster. If it was scale, it'd be scaling faster in that brief period. So a steep slope, more rapid value change, as opposed to down here, for instance, where it's almost flat. Between those two keyframes, there's a very slow change in value. That means that that object, in this case, is moving very slowly between these two keyframes. So as you look at the curves, you can get used to gauging the speed just by seeing what the slope is. And in fact, when you move the tangents, you can really start to affect that. For example, right here at the beginning, you see how the curve starts a little bit flat and then eventually starts to pick up speed. That means the cylinder is starting to move slow and then speeds up and then slows down again. But for example, I pick this first keyframe and change the tangent. I'll go back to the Move tool and then change the tangent to something like this. What this means is the cylinder moves really fast at the beginning and then starts to move slower here to the point that it almost stops and then moves fast again. So wherever the curve is flat or is almost flat, that just means that it slows down or even comes to a stop. It just means that where it's really flat like that, very little change in value. So by changing the shape of the curve by moving the tangent handles, you affect the speed. In fact, what I can do, just for demonstration, is delete out some of these center keyframes. Let's delete these out. I'm going to hide the graph editor for a second. I'm just going to hide this hill right now for a second. I'm going to look in the side view. I'll turn on smooth shading. Go back to the graph editor, and we'll play around with that. So of course I have to have the cylinder selected to see it. There we go. I'll go back to my translate Y. So if the curve is perfectly straight, but still has a fairly steep slope, it's moving fast, but it's moving the same amount across each frame. It's very even motion. However, if I do something like this with the tangents, it means a change in speed. At the beginning, the cylinder moves fast, then starts to slow down at the end. In fact, let's just play that back. So you can see that it's a little bit more rapid at the start and then slows down at the end. You can do the opposite if I go back to the graph editor, but making an opposite shaped curve like this. So like this, it's going to start really slow and then speed up. Let's give that a try. So here, in terms of how it's moving in the Y direction, it's not going very far at the beginning, and then it makes a big change and goes way down at the end. So these earlier frames, it's moving a tiny increment with each frame, and then towards the end, it starts making larger leaps across each frame in terms of distance. Now, I can exaggerate that by scaling all these curves, or at least scaling this Y curve by selecting the keyframes and going back to scale. I'll make the entire duration shorter here, and then fiddle with the tangent once again. So in this case, for the first 6 or so frames, it's not moving much at all, at least in terms of the Y direction. Now I haven't affected the other directions, I'm only dealing with Y here. So the Y change is fairly shallow, and then in terms of Y, it makes bigger changes in Y towards the end there. So now if I play this back, you see that for the first few frames, it pretty much stays up here at the top and then makes a big fall. Now it's continuing to move in the Z direction here because I haven't affected the Z channel. Remember, you're only working on one channel at a time. So when I say speed, it's really the speed of that one channel in terms of the speed of the value change. In this case, what distance that cylinder travels just in the Y direction for each frame. So for the first few frames, in terms of Y, it doesn't make hardly any change in the Y direction. And then towards the end, it makes much greater changes in the Y direction. So that's why it looks like it's hanging up there up at the top for a little bit and then makes a big fall. And at the end, the Z animation takes care of the motion as it moves towards the right there. So it takes a little getting used to, but after a little bit of practice, you'll get used to looking at these curves and determining if they're going to work for your particular animation or not. So deleting keyframes, moving keyframes, changing keyframe values, moving tangent handles to change the slope will all affect the animation. Now you can also insert additional keyframes here if you want to. Let's say you felt that your curve was a little too light. Like right now, so I delete all these keyframes on my Y curve. It's very simple. I'm going to move it so it lasts longer here. I'm just interactively moving the keyframes and then move the tangent handles. So I only have 2 keyframes here. So maybe I want to get back to having more control. I can insert keyframes. There's a couple ways to do that. There's Insert Keys tool right here. It's the second button from the left right here. If I click that, that'll become activated. I'll get a special X. And then I can middle mouse click somewhere on the curve. Middle mouse click. For every middle mouse click, you get a brand new keyframe with its own set of tangents. So again, the second icon here, which is called Insert Keys, then middle mouse click on the curve. There's also this third button here, which is the Add Keys tool. It works a little bit differently. Instead of giving you a line that indicates a particular area where the key is going to wind up, what you can do is middle mouse click, interactively drag, and place that wherever you want. So you're not stuck with a particular point in time that way. If you use this third tool, Once you middle mouse click, you can continue to drag until you get that keyframe where you want it. In fact, you can click and drag and move that keyframe anywhere along the curve there, like right here. Once you let go, the keyframe is set. So either one of those tools are fine for adding a new keyframe. So those are the basic tools you can use to fine-tune your animation. As I said, it takes some practice, but the more you practice in the graph editor, the easier it will become, and the more power you will have over fine-tune your animation. If you just stick with using the time slider, that tends to be a very crude way to manipulate your animation. It's much more powerful to stay inside this window right here.